Amen, and good morning. So glad that you are here this morning. I want to take a moment to just echo the welcome to our guests today. I got to meet a lot of new faces this morning in the foyer, and in particular, those among us who are college-age students. I know it's that time of year. College is starting back, and so we have several visiting today that are in that realm, and so just want to welcome you. Also let you know that there is a college-age class upstairs. If you go to the elevator and then go all the way to the end of the hall where the youth room is, there's a college-age class there, as well as a campus ministry that we support downtown by the UAB campus called the UAB Campus House. They meet on Tuesday nights and have free food. So take note of that. Anytime you can get some free food and a devotional. So want to encourage you to be a part of that. Today we begin a new series that I'm calling I Got Some Questions. And just right out of the gate, grammatically, I know that you may not prefer how this is written, but we can all agree, hopefully, that we all can think of times in life where we have questions. And answering those questions, or at least discovering and exploring those questions, can often be a helpful part of our journey. You may have heard the story of the two brothers who were always causing trouble in a small local church congregation. And so anytime something would come up, these two little brothers would be blamed for it. So if a firecracker went off in the bathroom, everybody would look at these two little brothers. If something would happen, if a squirrel would get loose in the auditorium, everybody would look at these two little brothers. If Kevin's mic was left on when he went to the bathroom, well, that was Kevin. But you get the picture. So what happened was the preacher decided that he was going to sit down with the oldest brother. Now, this preacher was a little older and not quite as patient as I am, and so he sat down with these actually sat down with the older brother, and he said, "Look, I'm going to think about some ways to put the fear of God in this young man." So what he wanted to do was to convince the young man that God was always watching, kind of the creepy all-seeing eye that we have sung about in the past. And so he sits down and he looks at the young man and he says, "Do you know where God is?" And the young man says nothing. He just sits there quietly. So a little more emphatically, he says, "Son, I said, do you know where God is?" Still nothing. And then finally the preacher slams his hand on the desk and looks at the boy and says, "Where is God?" And the boy gets up and runs out of the office, runs all the way home, gets home, goes through the front door, goes all the way up to the closet, gets in the closet. His little brother sees him, comes in, so he runs up to the closet, he opens the door, and he said, "What happened?" He said, "They think that we stole God, and I don't know where he is." If we're honest, there's times where it seems like in our culture today that God is missing. And today, I just want us to think about some of the questions that come up when we reflect on that reality. For some people, Christian or non-Christian, it just seems like God is missing when it comes to the world in which we live. And this causes questions. And sometimes these questions can become taboo, even in the church. And so I've compiled a list of 5 questions that we're going to look at over the next 5 weeks. You'll see those on the screen. And we're going to take time to examine each of these questions. Now, first off, I would say that I don't consider myself to be an expert in any of these areas. But I've done some homework, and my encouragement to you is to also do some of that homework. And so we are providing a more in-depth study guide. You'll notice some study questions in your worship guide, but I'm providing a more in-depth study guide that some of our ministry team has prepared. And you'll notice it looks kind of like your worship guide, but on the bottom it says Connect Group Study Guide. It's out there in the foyer at the guest services location, and it will help us kind of walk through and talk through and create a dialogue for these questions that we are exploring. This is also available in your Friday email. If you want a electronic copy of it, you can find find it there. But you're welcome to go through these in your personal time or with your friends or small group or family, and you can find that at the resources I mentioned a moment ago. The second observation that I will make is that these messages may feel less like sermons to you, and I get that. So I'm asking us to open up our hearts and our minds as we go through this series. We will get to the biblical text, I promise, but here's the reality. Christianity is under attack. And I think we would be hard-pressed to disagree with that statement. Matter of fact, most of us in this room, I would gather, agree with that statement, that Christianity is under attack. And so one of the premises that I'll be operating from during the course of this whole series is that if the Christian faith is true, then it has nothing to fear from close scrutiny and intense investigation. So as Christians, we need to learn how to be able to have these reasonable dialogues with those outside of the faith as we model intellectual integrity. So if you're a skeptic, or if you have doubts, or if you're watching this online, I just ask you to give the next few weeks a chance, and that you will be at least willing to be intellectually honest with the things that we talk about and the things that we ask. So the first question that I want us to consider as a part of this series is the question, is science and faith something that can coexist? And how do science and faith actually coexist? Are these two really at odds with each other? Or can we reasonably assert that our faith and the sciences are complementary to one another rather than always competing with one another? And to that end, I want to propose what I believe are 4 myths that people tend to assume to be true in our culture today. But in reality, these are just myths that do not hold up under careful investigation. And if you want to jot these down to maybe helpful in talking about these in your Connect groups tonight or as you have dialogues this week, you'll see on the screen the first myth is that faith and reason are at odds with each other, that they are competing. And this is kind of the climate that we find ourselves in and what we hear a lot. So can you be a person of reason, and can you believe things like the Genesis account? Or can you be a person of reason, and can you really believe that Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary? Can you be a person of reason, and can you believe that Jesus not only died and was buried in a tomb for 3 days, but that he rose from that grave? Can you have faith in those things and also be a person of reason? And what I'm suggesting today is that there is a myth that says, no, you cannot. You have to pick one or the other. And I would take it a step further and even say that there is an enemy that says you cannot, but that topic is coming up in a few weeks. So the myth is that in order to be a person of faith, you must basically shut off your brain and not examine the true evidences that are out there. But as people who follow Jesus, we should be the first to acknowledge that God created the brain, that God created the mind, and that he calls us through his Son to actually love him and love our neighbor through what? Through our mind. And so this is not just an intellectual exercise, but it's an intellectual exercise that is founded in what? It's founded and rooted in love. The rise of the scientific method in the 20th century was believed to eventually eradicate faith because science would begin to provide all the answers. This was the narrative that was being built in the 20th century, that science is getting better and better and better. And so the reality is that many scientists across all disciplines are becoming believers, not because they're running from their science, but they're becoming believers because they are diving more deeply into their science. This is true across all disciplines. In June of 2000, scientists were able to map the human genome. You'll see a picture of Frank Collins on the screen. And this was really a revolutionary time. Frank Collins stood beside President Bill Clinton and announced that we have mapped the human genome. And this was a project that took place not just in one laboratory, but laboratories across our nation and internationally as well. And Frank Collins was the one who coordinated this effort in a lot of ways. And what Frank Collins says, and also what the president proclaimed at that time, was we are learning, we have discovered the language of God. This is what was said. That this was not something that has caused us to run away from science, but it's caused us to acknowledge that there is a creator. Theologian Leslie Newbigin points out that statistically, the correlation between academic life and irreligion is much higher in the social sciences and the humanities than it is among the natural sciences. And he defines the natural sciences as physics, chemistry, and biology. Atomic physicists are much more likely to believe in God than sociologists. Basically what he's saying is that there are these observable sciences that are driving scientists to say, wow, there is something bigger going on here. There's something that we have to at least acknowledge and grapple with when it comes to these things that we are discovering. And this is something that's happened across disciplines in science, that my reason is actually becoming the reason for my faith in a lot of instances. So myth number 2 is that the church is hostile toward science. And to say that the church doesn't want science is historically just not true. People like Augustine used science to prove that Christianity was true. Individuals like Thomas Aquinas was called a scholastic. Why? Because he used Middle Age science to prove that Christianity was true. Mark Clark, in his book, The Problem of God, and you'll notice that I'll reference this book a number of times throughout this series. Mark Clark is a kind of a pastor, theologian in the Canada area, and he's written this book called The Problem of God. And what he says in this book is that Christian theology was the garden out of which modern science grew because it presented a world with distinct form, complexity, and design. And Christianity challenges us to experiment with what we see, believing that there is order and uniformity to the universe. And so in your study guide, in the more comprehensive study guide that I offer you, I give you a few other belief systems to consider that out of Christianity, the world can be viewed with natural order and therefore can be observable and studied. So you take certain beliefs like the belief of animism. It's spelled A-N-I-M-I-S-M, animism. And this belief says that God is what? God is in the tree, or God is in the rocks, or God is in the water. And so you can't really study those things because those things are God. But what does Christianity say? It's invited us to remind ourselves that God is the creator, and so we observe and we study the creation. We see God in those things. And it's invited us in the context in which science could actually grow. Universities were actually begun with this in mind. So several universities across our nation were started by Christians because there was this desire to explore not only our faith, but to explore reason as a part of our faith, places that we could study and learn. I want you to mark your calendars for September 4th. On Wednesday night, we've invited a couple to come here from Lipscomb University, friends of mine, JP and Beth Conway. And the interesting thing about this couple is that he is a preacher and she is a scientist. And so they talk about this conversation about faith and science. He is a local a minister in a congregation as well as a teacher, and she does cancer research for a living. And so you can imagine some of the conversations that they have been a part of throughout their story together. And they're going to be here on Wednesday night, September 4th, during our Outreach Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. To talk through some of these things. And I would encourage you to be here for that. Myth number 3 is that our society is growing more and more secular. How many believe this to be true? Wow, nobody believes this to be true. Maybe one. Okay, few people believe this to be true, that our society is growing more and more secular. Now, when I say that this is a myth, I'm not saying that our society is growing more and more Christian. But what some of today's thinkers would profess is that the point here is that the society has not gone in the direction that we thought it would go in the mid-20th century, and that is toward science, in the fact that as science gets bigger and better, religion, in particular Christianity, would be revealed to be a type of a crutch in people's lives. So according to Mark Clark, secularism has held philosophical sway in Western culture since the Enlightenment, that 1600 to 1800 period. Folks like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and the late Christopher Hitchens argue that science and naturalistic evolution have provided enough evidence to deduce atheistic conclusions to questions about origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. But Clark, get this, Clark also notes how the field of philosophy is actually being desecularized, a movement not by atheists but by theists. Theists like Alvin Plantinga. And Alvin Plantinga is one of the leading philosophers of our day, and he argues for the existence of God at such a high level that one atheist philosopher said that it was basically changed the game overnight. That because of the way that Plantinga argues for the existence of God, that overnight in the world of philosophy, it actually became intellectually and academically acceptable to argue for theism over atheism. And he's done this work for several years, and you can look him up on YouTube. He has a lot of interesting videos there as well. So what we see is that society is receptive to spiritual things. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean Christianity, but society is acceptable. The emerging millennial generation is being defined as spiritual, but not necessarily religious. But they come with this assumption. It's a hunger. It's an assumption that there is something bigger than ourselves. And for me, that is a great place to start. And so as society grows more spiritual, are we as Christians ready to present what we believe is true? Myth number 4 is that evolution proves that there is no God. Now, the reality is that we could spend a lot of time on this one myth. This is a big premise from guys like Richard Dawkins in his book, The God Delusion, that evolution proves that there is no God. In his book, he mentions the word evolution over 100 times. It's very much a big part of his writing. But I think what we are seeing from accredited philosophers and scientists alike is that they say this is too big of a jump. They're basically attacking Dawkins and saying that you can't just go from evolution to there is no God. You have to prove several things in between that in order to make that jump. It's not credible just to make that big of a jump. And so a lot of folks have debunked a lot of what Dawkins has said because I can't stand before you and prove with 100% certainty that God exists. I wish I could. I believe it with all of my being. I live it. I base my existence on it, but I can't stand before you with 100% certainty and tell you that God exists. But in the same way, neither can an atheist stand before you with 100% certainty and prove that there is no God. And so both of these are statements of faith. Both of these are coming from a faith worldview and a faith perspective. And this is one of the things that Clark would argue, that the atheistic perspective is also a statement of faith. Charles Darwin, who is noted for his work in the science of evolution, is noted as saying this toward the end of his life. Within me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of a man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Do you hear that? Do you hear what Darwin is saying? What Darwin is saying is that if my mind came from that of monkeys, if it evolved from that, then why should I trust my mind? What Darwin realized is that there was this struggle that he was caught in. It was his own struggle. What he had spent his life kind of studying and working through, he came to realize was a big struggle for him at the end. And so I want to leave you with the words of Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 1. And let me just say, if you are a person who is skeptical, if you're a person with doubts, if you're a person that has a lot of questions, I'm glad you're here. And let me tell you, Paul is your guy. Paul is your guy. Paul was about as anti-Christian as one could get. He was charged by the Jewish leadership to hunt down and persecute and even execute Christians. And so Paul knows exactly what it means to be anti-Christian. He lived that existence. He lived that life. That was until he had an encounter with the risen Lord. Until he had an encounter with Jesus. And when he had that encounter with Christ, he spent the rest of his life discovering, proclaiming, preaching, and defending the Christian truth. And we read several of his letters today, one of which is in Romans, in chapter 1, starting in verse 18. Paul says, "The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since they may be known about God is plain to them. What may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his internal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what is being made, so that people are without excuse." 2,000 years ago, get this, church, this is so vital. 2,000 years ago, what Paul is saying is that you look as close as you want. This is way before the microscope was invented. This was way before the telescope was invented. This is way before those nifty imaging machines in your medical offices were invented. Way before any of those things. Paul says, you take as close of a look as you want. And it will hold up. God will reveal himself to you. And if you're thinking, you know what, I want some more Bible in my sermon message, well, you're in luck, because next week we will ask the question, can the Bible really be trusted? So I'd encourage you to come back next week. And here's what I want to invite you to do. 3 things. One, I want to invite you to join us for all 5 weeks of this series. And I also want to invite you to join in a small group dialogue. That I believe this is a conversation that cannot just exist in one message on Sunday morning, but this is a conversation that all of us need to participate in on some level. And so I'd encourage you to do that. even with just a few friends or in a small group dynamic. Number two, I would encourage you to invite someone that has questions. Invite them to come and see. Come and see. Just come and see. And my promise to you is that I will be respectful. And as we go through this series, we will continue to ask one another to be intellectually honest with the things that we are talking about. And then number three, I would encourage you to, again, mark your calendars for September 4th and be here that night. I believe it's going to be a powerful opportunity for us to continue this conversation. And that's the invitation today. Those are the things that I invite you to. And as we continue these questions and these conversations, I want to continue to ask you to be in prayer. Will you bow your heads as we pray this morning? Father, I pray that you will give us eyes to see. I pray that you will give us ears to hear. I pray that you will give us minds to think through these questions. Father, renew our minds, and ultimately may we love you in this way. Thank you for those who are giving this material a hearing. I pray that you will help those of us in conversations. I pray that you will give us insights. I pray that you will give us confidence. I pray that even though we may not have all the answers, that we may trust in your Spirit's presence within us. And now, God, I pray that you water what's been sown today for your glory and for your honor. It's in Jesus I pray. Amen. I'm going to ask you to be standing with us as we sing this song. There'll be a shepherd down front and a shepherd and his wife back here in this room to my right. If you would like to meet with one of them and just pray with one of them, or if you'd like to know more about Jesus, we'd love to talk to you about that. Let's sing.
From the highest of heights to the depths of the sea, creation's revealing your majesty. From the colors that fall to the fragrance of spring, every creature unique in the song that it sings, all exclaiming, indescribable, Thank you for being here with us this morning. Brett, this is going to be a great series, and look forward to what you have to say. It was a good lesson this morning. Before we dismiss, we're going to sing one more song, and then we're going to be dismissed to our classes. But before we do, as we mentioned last week in our announcement, if you have any interest at all in learning more about Homewood for the holidays this December, a way that you can be part of the play, part of the music, part of the sets, part of the behind the scenes, whatever, we're going to meet briefly right over here in front of these pews right after church is over for about 10 minutes, and then you'll have time to get to class. So please come on down here and let us get some information and tell you a little bit about what's coming on. We're going to close with this great old hymn, and then we'll be dismissed. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Praise Him, all creatures dearly know. Praise Him among ye heavenly hosts. Praise Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. You're dismissed. Have a blessed week.
Praise Him, you heavens and all that's above. Praise Him, you angels and heavenly hosts. Let the whole earth praise Him. Praise Him, the sun, moon, and bright shining stars. Praise Him, you heavens and waters and skies. Let the whole earth praise Him.